the perfect segue into our conversation. So let's jump in. My clock reads 5 after the hour, 5 after 11 here in Puerto Rico. And we are going to get to the meat of our conversation with our guest, Manuel Laboy, today. First, just a piece of housekeeping. We are ramping up our activities through this summer at the Energy Forum. And one of the things that means is that we are publishing now a monthly newsletter that gives you updates on the latest news, the Energy Bureau updates, and other federal changes that have serious implications for what's going on in the local energy sector here in Puerto Rico. I'd like to encourage everybody to join the Energy Forum as a member. If you're not already, this is what the Puerto Rico Energy Forum News Roundup looks like. You can see it has links to all of our past episodes from the last month. This is a bit of an exception because we combined April and May here. News on the Energy Bureau, federal level developments, and then additional links that are helpful to understand additional context for PREPA, Luma, natural gas updates, solar updates, emergency measures, etc. So if you're interested in getting this on a monthly basis, reach out to us or join as a member, support the Energy Forum. We have something like 650 followers on LinkedIn right now. We'd love to get to 1,000. So we've noticed that the people that participate and enjoy these conversations and share them with their network are really key resources to making sure that this conversation that's important and relevant gets in front of more and more people. We also have a event coming up in September 15th and 16th for National Clean Energy Week. We had this last year. The Governor Pierluisi sent Representative Francisco Berrios to participate as the state level government proclaimed National Clean Energy Week on the island. We had folks from Luma, Genera, the private sector, investors, support infrastructure for the energy sector, and really had a couple of fantastic panels and conversations. We're expanding that event to 2 days at September 15th and 16th, and you'll see updates, save the dates, panelist confirmations, etc. in the coming weeks. But go ahead and put September 15th and 16th on your calendars as blocked off for National Clean Energy Week with the Puerto Rico Energy Forum. All right, that is all the housekeeping we have. And by we, I mean myself and my conversation partner, Tom King. Hi, Tom.
Hey, yeah, I was wondering when I was going to get to wording edgewise here. Manuel, thanks. Happy to see you again. I'm glad you've started up a new service focusing on something important, which you've been tracking. We should talk more about that generally. I mean, I've been doing similar things for different companies, more in tech. And there's a whole kind of other network through Holland and Knight and other people that might be useful to link up with in DC. But welcome, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right, our guest today is Manuel Laboy. Manuel was Secretary of Economic Development from 2017 to 2020. Later, he joined as the Executive Director for Core 3, the local administrator for federal funds. Manuel has a bachelor in chemical engineering and a master's in business administration from universities here in Puerto Rico and by the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez and Ana Jiménez, respectively. And Manuel, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Tom, for this opportunity. Looking forward for a great discussion.
All right, first question. If you personally controlled a one-time $10 billion capital infusion earmarked only for catalyzing Puerto Rico's long-run economic growth, where and how would you deploy it tomorrow?
Well, first, I will agree with the federal government to give us that money as a block grant and transfer that money to Puerto Rico as it happens with other federal funds.
Right.
The truth is that, yes, we do have $10.5 billion obligated, and another 7.4 billion or 7.6 billion dollars soon to be obligated on top of that for hazard mitigation. That brings the total to above 7.5, almost 18 billion. But the challenge is that that is all based on reimbursement, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that money in cash, except back in 2022, when I was in Puerto, that we negotiated a working capital advance. And then, of course, this case, PREPA, Luma, or Genera, depending on the project, they can request an advance of 25% of the total of a project once it's being approved by FEMA. So to your question, I will argue that we will need more flexibility, or at least resemble FEMA funding program to other programs like ARPA, for example, that they were not based on reimbursement. And then once you have that actual money, then you can really make meaningful changes, right? Because you do have this ammunition in your hands to actually make more progress, at least agile, and in a more faster pace than in the past. And let's assume that we can do that. Then, of course, two things, right? We also need to negotiate removal of red tape, because I think we could agree that our system is still fragile. Our system is still in crisis mode. Our system is, has been, the result of deferred maintenance and lack of proper capital improvements over the last couple of decades. Therefore, it is a fragile system. So operating in a regular framework of projects doesn't cut it, right? This is an emergency situation that you need to adjust that reality of policies and federal regulations to an emergency. So removing red tape without compromising proper planning, because you need to do proper planning, but removing excessive red tape. And then, of course, the ability to obtain certain waivers for things that take a lot of time, having the ability to negotiate better terms to bring equipment to Puerto Rico that right now is taking a lot of time. I heard stories from Luma and Genera, for example, that, a big critical equipment, usually before, the wars and before the pandemic, used to take 12 to 18 months to arrive to Puerto Rico. Now it takes twice of that, right? Close to 36 months. So assuming that you can actually, deal with those challenges, right? Removing the reimbursement requirement, removing unnecessary red tape, and of course, trying to negotiate better terms to bring equipment to the island faster, I will say that I will put my money right now in everything that addresses the short term. There's a short-term need. We need stability, and we don't have it. We can talk about, I am a big fan of renewables, right? I've been supporting renewables for a long time. But this is about stabilizing the patient, right? We cannot talk about whether you want to live another 50 years and do it, cleaner and more responsible with natural resources and so forth, and in a sustainable manner, when you're going through blackouts on a daily basis, correct? So you need to stabilize the system. I think we could all agree that there are some short-term actions to stabilize the system. And this will have a ripple effect, a positive effect in the economy and economic development and others, right? I will put money to stabilize the system. Right now, the projects that Luma it's doing, the projects that Genera are pursuing, they're going to bring a great benefit, but it's going to take another 2-3 years to get to that point, right? Whether you bring the new peaking units, the battery energy storage systems that Genera it's pursuing, the one set vegetation hazard mitigation measures of the island-wide vegetation is going to take 3 years to do that. In order to replace all these big substations, it's going to take quite some time, because it's just the nature of the process, right? The engineering, the long-lead items, construction, and so forth. We need to put money immediately to stabilize the system. So I think that the order that the Department of Energy issued back in May, they issued 2 orders that are very important. Number one, they issue emergency authority and empower Puerto Rico to take measures on an immediate term, right? Short term, to stabilize the system. And number one. And number two, this is, I know it's controversial. I know it is, but they're redirecting $365 million of DOE money for the Energy Resilience Fund to tackle that, right? And that's, of course, controversial, because that money was being directed towards solar PV, batteries, and so forth for vulnerable communities. And I agree that we need to do that. But at least on the short term, it's a trade-off analysis, right? We have to stabilize the system. So I will argue that everything that puts us in that path to get real stability, and then we can focus on the long-term planning, and then we can focus on the things that will take us to the next level in terms of affordability, in terms of resilience, and in terms of having a reliable system.
So,
Yeah,
so
I
let
don't
me.
think you get any pushback from at least from us on that. Well, I feel exactly the same way, right? I mean, and as Sam said earlier, we should act like we're in an emergency. And this is one of the things that you do, and it's one of the ways that the federal government can help. The other point you mentioned was to free up and waive any violations of the Clean Air Act or other things by running the oil stations. I wonder if that's more of a fig leaf than anything else, because if the oil stations were ready to run, they'd be running them. And I'm not sure that helps a lot, but maybe they can take some of that money if they deem it, reasonable, and do whatever short-term maintenance they need to do that you wouldn't normally do in order to keep those oil stations available for peaking. No, they don't peak very well, but it gives more latitude for the people on the ground to create exactly the stability and the short-term resiliency that is so desperately missing as we head into the summer and hurricane season. So.
When I think, Manuel, about the scenario that you just laid out, and that first question is sort of a magic wand. How would we use this $10+ billion that's available? One of the single most important constraints, structural constraints that I think about is that when you entered as Secretary of Economic Development in 2017, Puerto Rico was at the very beginning of its bankruptcy. And in 2016 to 2017, trying to figure out what even the legal mechanism to declaring bankruptcy looked like, with Promesa coming into the fold, and this is on top of the disasters at the end of September in 2017. That seems to me like a I don't want to say chronically under discussed, because I think it's recognized, but it seems like a major barrier to overcome, to actually be able to allocate funds in a block grant like way to an island that has not shown itself as the most fiscally responsible from the perspective of the federal government, to say, look, we want to help, but we also want to make sure these dollars are going to the most valuable end use that we can supply.
Absolutely. Let me combine Tom's comment to your argument, right, Sam? I think that everybody has to recognize that Puerto Rico's bankruptcy has really undermined our ability to move forward with critical policies associated with economic development, and specifically the energy transition, right? And let me put this under this perspective. When Maria happened, everybody knows that the energy system collapsed, right? Everybody knows the reasons why, and Maria just showcased the reality of what was happening in decades of deferred maintenance, lack of vision, lack of capital investments, and so forth. But if PREPA wasn't in bankruptcy mode at the time that Maria hit Puerto Rico would have done what we did back in Georges in 1998, and what the states has done, like recently Florida with the Hurricane Helene, and North Carolina and others, right? They either go to their own pockets, right? State funds, rainy day funds, and so forth, right? You actually have cash. You're supposed to have a lot of cash if you're not in bankruptcy, right? Assuming that you are under, let's say, general terms, economically, fiscally, you're doing okay. You have cash reserves, and you go there and you start, doing a lot of things without waiting for the federal government to intervene. And number two, you have the ability to access the capital markets. You go, like PREPA did back in Georges, and you go and you issue bonds, and you get $2 billion, $3 billion, and you start fixing the system, right? Without intervention on the federal government. This is what happens in the states as well. Of course, to your point, you got to do it responsibly, right? When you issue bonds, you got to do it responsibly when you get into debt. When you use your own cash, you have to be responsible. Puerto Rico, of course, had Promesa back in 2016, because for a lot of mismanagement and irresponsibilities over decades of, related to fiscal economic matters. And of course, we were declared bankrupt in 2017, a couple of months before Maria. That was a real perfect storm, right? So right now, I will argue that if Puerto Rico was not in bankruptcy back in those days, and we didn't have a bad reputation in the federal government, because that's the reality, right? There was not goodwill, the name of Puerto Rico in those times, right? 2016 and so forth, and moving forward, we don't have really good reputation, whether it was true or not, right? That was the perspective, correct? So we couldn't go to the capital markets. We don't have any cash. So we needed to depend solely on federal funds that came with a lot of strings attached because our name was not, in good terms, correct? That is a reality, okay? If we wasn't for that, we would have done like other states have done, is that you start fixing correctly, you do proper planning, you go out there, it's still doing fixing, you still doing resilient projects. Puerto Rico had a great framework between 2019 and 2020, right, when we legislated Act 17. And there was in place a number of important policies, from the energy perspective, from the incentives perspective with Act 60. So from the legislative standpoint, we have the tools. If we had access to capital at that time, and if our name was in that poor condition back then, it would be a very different story today. But the reality is that that's what we were facing. So federal funds came with a lot of conditions on top of typical red tape, right? I'm talking about traditional red tape on top of conditions that were already imposed for Puerto Rico because of that. And we were in bankruptcy. Those are the things that determined the future of Puerto Rico over the last 8 years.
So, Manuel, let's fast forward to today. How do we reconcile these twin goals of near-term hurricane or natural disaster resiliency and long-term fiscal sustainability? Is it just a slow process? And as you said, it's going to take several years, bit by bit, and we really hope that we don't have another disaster in the meantime? Or is there another strategy that we need to deploy?
So here's my take. I think that when you look at where we are today with the federal funding for the electrical reconstruction, right? If you look at the transparency portal, this information that I'm about to give you, it's public, right? You have two buckets on the FEMA side, right? You have the $10.5 billion, which have been obligated, and you have an additional 7.6 billion, give or take, for mitigation, right? So this is about 18 billion. Eventually, right? The total number will get to that point. So the 10.5, there's been about $7 billion that have been approved by FEMA. 7 billion out of 10.5, give or take, obligated by FEMA. But most of that is to order equipment, about $3 billion, and about $1 billion for engineering and architectural work that you need to do. So that leaves you about 2.3 billion for actual projects. It means that the rest of the $3 billion is for projects combined with this equipment budget that is about 3 billion. That's to order long lead items, big transformers and transmission lines and so forth. Then you have the other bucket, which is 7.4 billion, which is hazard mitigation. And so far, FEMA has obligated 10% of that, about, 734 million dollars. So you have another 6 point something billion to go to actually get approved, and you're going to have a lot of money for mitigation. That means elevating substations. That means spending actual resilience projects, right? So my perspective is that all those long-term projects that are more resilient oriented is going to take time. It's going to take time to replace all these old substations. Replacing them with the newest technology up to code and standard, and then elevating them because some of them or many of them are in flooded areas, right? That's going to take time. So what can we do in the short term as we go through all these complicated projects that is going to take another 5 to 10 years? Number one, on the very short term, I agree that we need all this extra generation. And that's the RFP that PREPA finally, I think that they just awarded. And they're planning to add 800 megawatts of additional generation capability. Without getting into the specifics, right? I'm not getting into the terms and conditions, right? I'm just talking about plain simply adding megawatts to the system. That is something that we needed to do, right? Number one, we also need to push for renewables, right? I think we were doing a great job over the last 4 years to push for renewables, right? The wave of technologies that the system can take because of what the industry offers. Solar, wind, distributed solar, and so, right? We need to continue that despite of the fact that today at the federal level, it's very challenging, right? Some of these policies, have impacted the deployment of federal funds for what it's known as a green revolution, right? But at least on the local level, we have to find a way to continue pushing for renewables. And then third, we need to accelerate to the extent possible. That means removing red tape, federal red tape, the vegetation mitigation, right? Because the reality is that 50% of the blackouts, according to Luma, has to do with this crazy, vegetation island-wide that had grown out of control after Maria. If you tackle those three things on the short term, I think we have a good chance to stabilize the system. And then, of course, I know for a fact that Luma is working on critical, on what's known as single points of failure, right? There's a bunch of single points of failure island-wide that they have identified. Like, for example, Santa Isabel, remember the Santa Isabel situation a couple of years ago. They are trying to tackle those single points of failure on the short term as they move forward with distribution, automation, and other similar projects, right? That's on the short term. Then you have the second wave of projects on the medium term. And medium term for me is the next 3 years, right? And that's where you have the peaking units. You have the battery energy storage system that Genera is pursuing. And then close to short term, right there, bottom line, let's say in 3 or 5 years, you have a new plant, right? You have a new LNG plant that is going to be constructed on the north side of Puerto Rico. And that's going to provide you with the level of resiliency that you need. And then you have, of course, the long term, which is all this federal funding that is going to be deployed for very complicated, large projects that just takes time, to deploy them. So the question is, how do you fit into that? Not only resiliency but sustainability, right? Renewables, because at the end of the day, this sounds fantastic, and we can tackle short-term issues, but we don't want to be getting in a situation 10 years down the road that all of a sudden we're still dependent on fossil fuel. We're still dependent on sources that we do not control whatsoever. And that's the challenge here, right? And I'll give you one interesting point, because I'm researching about Trump's administration. The reality is that we all know that, they have some, they don't really like what we call renewables, in the traditional sense. But interesting, Secretary of the DOE, Chris Wright, and the Trump administration happens to support geothermal. Interesting, right? They're actually supporting geothermal, and they're pushing for more geothermal power, especially enhanced geothermal systems in the United States. Now, Puerto Rico, of course, has very little opportunity in geothermal, but I have spoken in the past about a cousin, if you want to call it that way, of geothermal, which is ocean thermal, right? It does the same thing. Geothermal is on land and ocean thermal is on the sea. So I will argue that if the Department of Energy under the Trump administration is pushing for geothermal, I think it opens the opportunity to push for ocean thermal, right? It will be along the lines of policies that the Trump administration will support, but that's not going to give you any short-term benefits, right? This is looking forward between medium and long term. And then I will tell you two things that I'm following very closely, right? Which is hydrogen development and nuclear, right? Hydrogen, I believe that Puerto Rico has an immense opportunity in hydrogen, specifically green hydrogen. Remains to be seen what happens with this big, beautiful bill that is under evaluation by Congress, because there are some doubts about whether that bill, supports or not, green hydrogen into the future. But certainly the Trump administration is pursuing more nuclear in the United States, and there is a growing supporting Puerto Rico that's been dormant for a while, that they actually support nuclear, especially because of these modular small designs that are more safer and probably, could be a fit for Puerto Rico in the future. So that's the landscape that I see on the short, medium, long term.
Yeah, I fascinating. I've got a couple of questions for you about OTEC here in a moment. Before we get there and moving towards the microeconomics of it as opposed to the macro economic policy here, uh, how much of a role should non-market factors have in determining the rate of electricity in Puerto Rico? Because I think that's one of the conversations that Tom and I have had a number of times in the Energy Forum is how do we make sure that not only we can get PREPA out of bankruptcy, but we can, which access to capital markets, access to permanent work and improvements, et cetera. But then also improving the competitiveness of the bidders that come in and a private sector capital that says, I want to develop projects on the island with them as my off taker. And so I think everybody appreciates that PREPA's bankruptcy is a hurdle here. The mechanism of getting out of that bankruptcy, I think, really comes down to revenues, right? How do they generate revenues? So, what role? I mean, thinking about the economics of energy here a little bit, what role should market or non-market factors have in the price of energy?
That's a tough question, Sam, because I think that when you look at the fiscal plan, the Puerto Rico fiscal plan, right, that has been elaborated and updated by the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, there are some debates on what's going to happen with Puerto Rico into the future, right? Number one, what is the outlook of economic growth, right? It's interesting because when you look at the numbers, I just reviewing some of them. Of the last 8 years, you have key sectors like manufacturing, construction, trade, transportation, utilities, and professional business services that the jobs are just increasing in a good pace. Let me give you manufacturing. Back in January 2017, when I started as Secretary of Economic Development, there were 73,000 jobs in manufacturing. December 2024, 83,000, right? 10,000 more jobs in 8 years. And that number might continue to go up if the reshoring strategy succeeds, with I think it has a good chance, to provide, some incredible outcomes, right? This is going to be important for the energy forecast in the future because you need actual clients, right? And one of the clients that has always been important for Puerto Rico is the manufacturing sector, right? Trade, transportation, and utilities back in January 2017, 174,000 jobs. Today is about 192,000. So those are good numbers. When you look at the gross national product growth in fiscal year 2024, it was 2.1%. The economic activity index in fiscal year 2024 was 2.9%. These are great numbers, but the question is, are we going to be able to sustain that? And when you look at the fiscal plan, there is some doubts about that on the long term. That's number one. So I think that, again, when you marry that with the strategy of reshoring, I think it is important that we succeed because it is, that gives you, an important dimension in terms of bringing activity to Puerto Rico that goes along with the energy profile, right? Second, you have the demographics, and that is even more debatable, right? Today, we have 3.2 million people in Puerto Rico, our population. For the first time, I think in years, last year was a year that we didn't lose that amount of people. Actually, I think it was neutral. Actually, we actually gained some population. But if we look again at the fiscal plan, they're forecasting that in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to drop to 2.5 or 6 million. Again, that puts a lot of stress into the system, correct?
Yep.
So those are two factors that I will argue that we need to really understand, right? What is going to be our demographics and population? And number two, what is going to be our economic profile in the next 10 or 20 years? Because that's going to determine a lot of the future of the energy system. And then to your point, then you have the actual bankruptcy of PREPA. Let's assume that we get out of that next year. I don't know if they're going to happen this year. Let's assume that we're lucky and we get a bankruptcy next year. Under which conditions, right? It is expected that the rate is going to go up, right? No matter how you see it, no matter, different angles, it seems like it's going to go up. So I think we need to also understand what it means affordable power in Puerto Rico, right? I remember when we were putting together Invest Puerto Rico back in 2017, right? We started pushing for Invest, we got the legislation done, and we visited Ohio. As the Secretary of Economic Development, I visited Ohio, I met with the Jobs Ohio team. and they were talking and this and that and gave us great tips in terms of how to pursue, invest Puerto Rico as we know today. And they were telling us, what is the rate of electric power in Ohio? Well, it's about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. We will never compete to that, at least on the short term, right? That is a reality. So what should be the benchmark for Puerto Rico? What should be a reasonable benchmark? Is it Hawaii? Is it other island nations similar to Puerto Rico? I will argue that shouldn't be Hawaii because Puerto Rico is not Hawaii. Puerto Rico is an industrialized economy. Hawaii is not, right? Those are the questions. And I think that's going to determine a number of things about the market because, and again, the reality is that we have to understand what is the meaning of affordability. Do we want to, is a trade-off, right? Do we need to have affordable power, reliable and resilient at the same time, those three conditions? I think everybody wants that, right? And I want that too. But at this point, we need more resilient and more reliable power. That is
Absolutely.
non-contested, right? Affordability, we need to understand that better, but we need to do it not in a vacuum. We need to understand the economy. We need to understand our profile. We need to understand where we're heading to the future.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. You said something I want to highlight, which is we need clients, right? For
Exactly.
for energy. And so sort of leads perfectly into my next question, which is walk us through your case for or against further subsidies for distributed solar, given that that might pose a risk to the amount of clients that the grid has.
I am a firm believer of best practices, right? Industry best practices and what has worked in other jurisdictions from the public standpoint, right? From the policy standpoint. I talk to some people every now and then, and they have their own positions about whether government should subsidize at the state level or the federal level, and a number of industries, right? Folks that will tell you that they're against subsidizing manufacturing, right? And we have to understand that if you don't provide that sort of subsidy or something, well, let's not call it subsidy, right? Incentives, smart incentives. With a return of investment, correct? Something that you can measure in a transparent manner and something that can also be under continuous improvement over time, right? I would argue that you always need smart investment, smart incentives that provide return on investment. And this is going to be a debate not only on the energy sector, but people will tell you, oh, we don't want necessarily to incentivize tourism because hotels should be developed on its own terms because there is demand, right? There is already demand. Why we need to incentivize hotel construction? Because there's more and more tourists coming to Puerto Rico. Well, the reality is that you need to offset construction cost. Number one. So I will argue that yes, there's always has to be policies to support the deployment of the next generation of technology, in this case, energy, that aligns with the three things, right? Aligns with sustainability, affordability, and well, affordability, we just talk about that, but at least, sustainability, resilience, and reliability, right? We need those three things. And hopefully affordability will get to some sweet spot at some point. And yes, we will need to argue, I will argue in favor of smart incentives for that, as we also need for other areas like manufacturing, for example, or promote export services. That's the reason why we put together the incentives code, right? That we needed something that was holistic, something that was rationalized, right? That provided a better understanding of investment opportunities in Puerto Rico, for those opportunities, for those in the island or abroad that wanted to invest Puerto Rico. And energy is a key area for all the reasons that we know of. So I would argue, yes, that we need smart incentives with a return on investment on energy on the state side, incentives, and of course at the federal side.
I've got one more question about Puerto Rico competitiveness and sort of economic development policy. But if you were a rating agency's chief economist, what single data series would you look at to gauge real investor confidence in Puerto Rico? Where would you look to say, "Ah, okay, that's the metric that we can have a better understanding of where Puerto Rico's economy is going?"
Well, it happens that I met with the credit agencies when I was in Core 3, supporting AFAF, the fiscal agency. So the director of AFAF, my friend Omar Marrero, and I, and other folks from the government, we visited the credit agencies, Moody's and so forth, on a periodic basis, since 2022. So we kept them completely transparent and updated about everything was happening in Puerto Rico from the economic standpoint, from the fiscal standpoint, and from the federal funding standpoint, right? And I think that at this point, credit agencies, number one, they just want to make sure that they can continue believing in Puerto Rico, right? The data in the past was not necessarily reliable, right? Puerto Rico, we just talked about it, its name was not in the best shape, in the federal government and credit agencies, and we know the results, right? But today is different. I think that based on my experience in those meetings, number one, they really appreciate the fact that Puerto Rico has done meaningful fiscal reforms, right? Transparent, updated information about all the fiscal and economic key indicators, right? That is very much appreciated. The fact that we have processes in place that we didn't have in the past, the fact that we are more disciplined at this point that compared to 10 years ago, it's something that is very much appreciative. The question that they pretty much presented to us on almost all those meetings is about, can we sustain that? That is the question, right? The question is, can we sustain that? And that has to be the focus, in my opinion, right? We need to provide a level of comfort to the markets, to the federal government, to the credit agencies, to the markets, right? To the capital markets, that we not only are in the right direction, but we do have the processes and the controls in place that we can make this sustainable. That is the key. Number one. Number two, there are some key indicators in Puerto Rico that I would think we need to overhaul. Let's look at the economic index activity, the economic activity index, actually. And they look at a couple of activities, like, for example, a consumption of energy, I believe is the consumption of the sales of cement, jobs, and I forgot the last one. I think is it fuel or car sale? I don't remember. We need to really, I know that the reason why we have those indexes, because they do correlate almost, perfectly, with economic growth, right? Whether it's GNP or GDP. But we need to start proposing new indicators that are more aligned with sustainability and resilience, right? Because if we continue to measure our economy based off fuel consumption and how many cars we sell, well, that caught it in the past, but not in the future, right? I think that we need to come up, if I were chief economist, I will tell you that I will bring the brightest mind, and we need to overhaul all these indicators, because those are the indicators of the past. We need indicators for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things you were talking about there, it's hard to just take the standard economic format of leading indicators that you see in other places and just directly apply them to Puerto Rico. First of all, I mean, there's different circumstance, and you can usually gauge the business confidence and individual confidence in the future as an indicator that the economy is going to grow over a period of time. And you usually look at how much are they borrowing, right? How much are they investing? And that's kind of meaningless in Puerto Rico when credit is so low, that it's almost the opposite. Are people depleting their savings? If they're depleting their savings, it's probably an indication that they're buying things and that they're positive. But it could also mean that we just had another hurricane and everybody's completely scrambled. So that's very interesting, and I think that's a great answer to Sam's question.
Yeah,
And
sorry, go ahead, Manuel.
Yeah, I just very quick reaction. That's why I think it's important to look at the right indicators, right? Like, for example, when we were trying to measure, or you measure, penetration of renewable energy in Puerto Rico, wanted to understand, interconnections, correct? That's one way to measure it. That's why when I look at jobs, and to your point, Tom, there's no doubt that the federal infusion of funds since Maria and then the pandemic it was a major driver of growth, especially consumption, retail, and so forth. But I will say that if you look at the key sectors that are putting the jobs out there, right, they're growing in terms of jobs. If we had retail and we had government jobs going up, and then you have manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, and tourism jobs going down, we have a big problem. You see?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you're posting 3%, 4% of GDP or GNP growth. It doesn't matter whether you're posting economic activity index in 3% growth every year. When you look at the specifics, it's just wrong, right? Because you cannot grow your economy solely on consumption, spending, and retail and government jobs, right? You need the key sectors like manufacturing, construction, professional business services, and hospitality and leisure, to name some of them, to post actual jobs growth. That gives me confidence that I think there's a great possibility that we can prove that the fiscal plan might not necessarily be our future, right? Because if you look at that plan and if that's our future, certainly we have some big issues, right? In terms of losing population and losing clients, like Sam mentioned, right? So when I look at today's possibilities, the tariffs that has been imposed by Trump, yeah, they are problematic in many aspects, but the reality is that if we can push now for Build America, Buy American in Puerto Rico, if we can push for farmer reshoring, and we couple that with Act 60, that can be a great combination of opportunities for Puerto Rico, including the energy sector.
Speaking of the energy sector, Manuel, you've been a major proponent of ocean thermal energy conversion. You mentioned a moment ago, sort of the marine cousin of geothermal. I am a skeptic, and so I want to give you an opportunity to
Me too.
lay out the case.
I know.
And one of the key reasons why I am not yet convinced is the cost. And so lay out, if you would, what is the pathway towards bankability of an OTEC system in general, but maybe specifically in Puerto Rico?
I know. I recognize that sometimes I am like that we need to convince more people. I realize that, and skepticism is not bad, by the way. I think it's a good thing, right? Because you need to prove, right, and provide evidence, and then convert more people. So yes, number one, ocean thermal, it's pretty much like the marine consent of geothermal, right? It's the same engineering, the same science behind it. Now, a couple of things about ocean thermal, and we get into the cost, because to your point, Sam, it is the biggest hurdle, right? The cost is being a challenge, right? Because it is capital intensive. It is hugely capital intensive. So there's a lot of capital investment at least for the initial power plants associated with ocean thermal. And I don't have to go into the benefits, right? I mean, it's 24/7, right? A base load power. Like geothermal doesn't produce greenhouse gases, so it's sustainable, it's clean, and again, it's base load, which I think is very important. And on top of that, with a very high power factor, experts say that it should be at least 90% of the power factor associated with running a plant like this. And it has a bunch of benefits, like deep ocean water applications. Like you can have a byproduct in terms of distilled water, and then you can use the bottom ocean water to do other things. Like you can do for example, a resort-oriented sea water air conditioning, and you can use it for algae production and aquaculture and so forth. So there's a bunch of benefits. So what is the reality of ocean thermal, and why there's maybe some skepticism? Number one, I think there is a myth that this still needs like proof of concept, right? OTEC doesn't need proof of concept. OTEC has been already proved in the 1970s and in the 1980s and later in the early 2000s. Proof of concept is there. The federal government and the experts has always said that the engineering of OTEC is not an issue whatsoever. It's not a technical viability issue. Environmentally speaking, it's not an environmental issue. It's a benign technology, Like any other technology, you need to manage certain risk. Like when you bring a lot of water from the ocean, from the bottom of the ocean, and you need to dump that water back. Yes, that has to be done in a responsible manner, to give an example. But from the environmental standpoint and from the engineering technical standpoint, that is not an issue. That has been researched plenty over decades. The issue is really the financials, right? To your point. And I don't want to call it the issue, it's the challenge. Because this is going to be the chicken or the egg, right? Um, Experts say that you need right now a plant that has to be between 2.5 megawatts inland or land-based, or at least 10 megawatt if it is offshore. Some proponents are saying that maybe 20, 25 megawatts is doable from the engineering standpoint today. But is the chicken or the egg? Because you want reliable data in terms of scaling up for what has been already been proved over decades, which is small scale, and go up, scale it up, produce that data, and that is going to give the comfort of the private sector, the private investors, and the market to invest once you have reliable data produced from a 2.5, 10 megawatt, or 20 megawatt plant, right? On the contrary, without that data, like it has happened in other technologies in the past, like solar, like wind, way in the past, government steps in and invest in this technology and then passes the baton to the private sector to continue that, because then there is enough risk tolerance for the private sector to get in, right? So it is not, again, it's not a technical viability issue, it's not environmental, it's really the capital investment and the debate of what is really, how are you going to measure a cost effectiveness? Are you going to measure cost effectiveness based on whether you're building a 10 megawatt or a 20 megawatt plant versus the cost, or are you going to measure cost effectiveness based on levelized cost of energy? Because the levelized cost of energy of a 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt plant, without any government intervention in terms of subsidies and incentives, is being estimated to be 22, between 18 and 22 cents a kilowatt hour without any government intervention, which is for base load renewable energy is not that bad. And the other thing that I will argue about with the skeptics is that at the end of the day, an OTIC plant is really a combination of systems integration of other mature industries. There's a lot of components in mature industries like oil and gas, like industrial refrigeration, just to name a few, that all of the critical components for an OTEC plant are already available in the market in mature industries like oil and gas and industrial refrigeration. So it's a strategy of system integration of existing components and the ability to actually, design this plant in a system integration approach that will yield the necessary data in a 2.5 megawatt to 25, depending on the approach. So the private sector will gain the necessary confidence to take it from there and build then plants that are going to be 100 megawatts and above. And that's a very, summarized discussion about, how I think ocean thermal should be approached.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at over a dozen different ocean thermal companies as they've been developing. Back in my private equity days, many of them came, when they're working in Hawaii, a couple of working here, some of them actually working in other countries. There's a unique kind of situation where they can actually be located. Clearly, if you incorporate some of the offshore oil techniques and you can actually prove it, that could happen. I think there are a lot of practical problems that need to be overcome. You're talking about differences in temperature between effectively surface water and deep water, and in some cases, you see differences of, especially in the area around Puerto Rico, where you've got the sun and the thing heating up the surface, but you've got low currents of 50 degrees or so Fahrenheit, right? So that's okay, but it's not a huge delta T, right? I mean, if you're looking at low temperature extraction of energy, it kind of doesn't matter as long as you've got it. But if you've got a big difference between that, then the heat exchange is going to be valuable. The lower the heat exchange that you have, the greater the flow you need. Right now, the greater the flow you have in terms of the size of the pipes and other things, it's much better to have one or two big pipes than a bunch of smaller pipes in terms of resistance, etc. However, once you make the pipe bigger, you have the problem of how do you continue to get the water, etc., to turbulate in the big tubes, because what'll happen is you'll get heat exchange on the outside, but you won't get it in the center of the pipe if there's just flow. So, these are really difficult practical problems that you have to overcome. And I haven't seen anybody attack that in any kind of sensible way in order to get to the point where you could actually make these things viable, even for a 2.5 megawatt plant. So I'm not saying it can't be cracked. The question, of course, is should it be cracked if it takes, in my estimation, at least $1 billion of research in order to get there, kind of mostly on the public dime, some private, when there are many, many others, hydrogen, et cetera, that it's much more useful that you can convert, using nuclear, using whatever to give you, power, baseload power, preferably
Well,
nuclear for baseload, et cetera.
and
So
and
anyway,
and
I'm
and,
just
and
saying, I
maybe
think it's interesting, and as a scientific experiment, it's worth continuing to put money into it. But from a mechanical delivery, I think we're a long way off.
Well, and maybe this is where one of Puerto Rico's comparative advantages is with regards to the industry is the ability to do research and development and ultimately get
Yeah.
it to a commercialization standpoint. I want to shift gears just slightly. We've got about 5 minutes left, 5, 10 minutes left. I want to do a bit of a lightning round, Manuel, where I throw out an idea or a concept, and you can reply if you think it's overrated or underrated or maybe appropriately rated, and maybe why. You up for that?
Yes. Very quickly, I just want to react
Yeah,
to
please.
Tom's comment.
Yeah.
No, listen, it's a great debate, and it should take hours, right, of conversations to reply to what you said. I do have to say that I disagree, with some of the things that you said, Tom. But the bottom line is this, right? I think that the mechanical engineering challenges that ocean thermal might have to scale up to the level that it needs to scale up, they can be successfully addressed from my perspective. I've been studying OTEC for the last 20 years. And here is the interesting fact. Once they are overcome, there's no other technology that can put Puerto Rico in a pioneering path, right? Everybody else is doing nuclear. Everybody is doing hydrogen. I support nuclear, by the way, and I support hydrogen. I think we should do it in Puerto Rico. But from the standpoint of positioning Puerto Rico as a pioneer in the world, there's no other technology that has that potential. So that's my take on it. So I just wanted to respectfully
No,
react, Tom.
no. Thank you for
Look,
that point.
I love the idea of continued
Yeah,
research. I think
sure.
but it's gonna be a lot of money, a lot of pilots, and Puerto Rico is not a bad place at all to kind of test this out, as long as the federal government is willing to continue to put money into it. Um, you know, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's probably more of a matter of working fluids, right? The better your working fluid, the more energy and heat you can extract, out of it. So the more efficient that becomes, that's one thing. And then, dealing with large flows is not it's not strictly mechanical. The answers are probably mechanical in terms of whatever you come up with, but it's also a question of fluid dynamics, which I know enough to know that I don't know enough about it, but that I do know that it's very important in terms of how the thing actually works and being able to extract the most that you can out of it to generate that. And that seems to me like the holy grail. If you can really crack that, then you can begin to make it economical, despite the
Sure.
huge capital cost you're talking. So.
All right, I'm going to jump into a couple
Okay.
of these concepts,
Yes,
and Manuel, you can give me your response.
sure.
Public-private partnerships for the water utility in Puerto Rico.
For the water utility. Interesting. I think that that's something that can be considered in the future. Today, I think that they are running in terms of excellent, parameters in acceptable parameters. So maybe in the future.
Regional power companies for Puerto Rico
For generation
and grid management.
and grid management. Oof, interesting.
So the decentralization of Prepa, Luma, and Genera.
I think on the generation side, it could be more, viable. On the transmission distribution, it all depends on what's going to be the microgrid approach, right? If the microgrid strategy works, it can open the door for that. Yeah.
All right, the Port of Ponce as a logistics hub.
Yes, it has potential. It has potential from the perspective of number one, see Puerto Rico as the like a port island, right? From the disaster management, disaster recovery perspective, and also from the sustainability perspective, I think that it has potential. Yes.
The PR 100 study.
I fundamentally disagree with a number of things of that study.
You want to
So I
give us
think
one or
that is an
two?
opportunity to actually revisit that.
Can you give us one or two of the things you disagree with?
Yeah.
Well, because it's when you look at the study, the conclusion is that it's like Puerto Rico should just be solar PV and batteries island wide, and that is one key area which I support, but it should be a more diverse portfolio.
So on that point, your take on biogas as an input to Puerto Rico's energy matrix.
I think that Puerto Rico should have a diverse portfolio that includes it could be biogas, that includes a hydrogen, that includes nuclear, that includes ocean thermal, and maybe other energy, water energy, marine energy sources as well, combined with, of course, what we know today in terms of solar PV and batteries and also wind. It has to be a combination.
Plantains as an export crop.
Ooh, plantains as an export crop? I have to give that more thought.
All
How
right.
many other people eat them? I mean, I will occasionally buy them in the supermarket and make them up, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure
I
how
had
many
to
others do.
give it more thought to that.
All right. My last question, I know we're running out of time here, is that, if listeners and viewers of the Energy Forum can take one actionable insight from your career at sort of the intersection of energy, federal financing, and fund availability and economic policy, what should that takeaway be?
Um, well, I think that we are in a very important crossroad. We have to demonstrate, I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, federal funds are going to continue to play a fundamental role in the years to come, right? In terms of our critical infrastructure, economic development, and that includes, of course, the energy sector, right? Whether it's in the shape of disaster recovery grants or whether other laws like the ones that were passed under the past federal administration, like the infrastructure bill and so forth, right? Or whether is policies that are equally important, right? Provide grants, provide loans, provide a number of tax credits. They're going to play an important role in the years to come, right? So it comes down to two things. I think that number one, Puerto Rico needs to leave behind the days that our name was not in good shape, right? We need to leave fully behind bankruptcy. And we need to make sure that in the eyes of the federal government, in the eyes of the credit agencies and the markets, Puerto Rico has fiscal discipline that we have learned from the past, and that Puerto Rico has the controls in terms of making sure that we are fiscally responsible. And on the other hand, that when it comes down to managing federal funds, we are at the top of the jurisdictions that have shown that we do know what we're doing and that we are doing it in compliance and transparency, right? And number three, then it comes down to cracking the code. We need to crack the code about the future of Puerto Rico in terms of how is that going to shape energy policy? Again, clients from the industrial perspective, clients from the, at the retail level, we need to really understand that. And I hope that we prove the fiscal plan wrong. we need to prove it that it's wrong, that we're not heading that path. Okay, that we're gonna head into the path of actually, hopefully, growing back our population in a smart way, right? In a planned way, in a smart way, and that we are going to revitalize our key industries based on what has happened over the last 8 years.
Manuel, thank you very much, and really appreciate you joining the Puerto Rico Energy Forum for this conversation. I found it insightful and appreciate your time.
Thank you
Yeah,
both, Sam
it's been
and
fun.
Tom. This has been a very good discussion. I really
Get
appreciate it.
get back to us on plantains as an export crop,
I
and
will think about that.
and
Yeah.
and we'll share it with our audience. But
Yes.
I think we'll leave it there, and Manuel, talk to you soon.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.